Welcome to Liz McMullen's Retrospective series, where I read a body of work. I've had the joy of reading Jane Lawless series by Ellen Hart, and I'll give you a little bit of a background on the mystery mistress herself. Ellen Hart is the author of 35 crime novels in 2 different series. She is a 6-time winner of the Lambda Literary Award for Best Lesbian Mystery, a 4-time winner of the Minnesota Book Award for Popular Fiction, and a 3-time winner of the Golden Literary Award. In 2009, she was made an official literary saint by the Saints and Sinners Literary Festival in New Orleans. In 2010, Ellen was given the Trailblazer Award from the Golden Crown Literary Society, a Lifetime Achievement Award in the field of lesbian literature. In December of 2016, Mystery Writers of America named her the 2017 Grand Master. She is the first openly LGBT writer to receive this prestigious honor. The award represents the pinnacle of achievement in mystery writing and was established to acknowledge important contributions to the genre, as well as for a body of work that is both significant and of high quality. Other masters included Stephen King, Agatha Christie, Sara Paretsky, P.D. James, and Alfred Hitchcock. For the past 15 years, Ellen has taught an introduction to writing the modern mystery through the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis, the largest independent writing community in the nation. She lives in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, with her partner of 40 years. I know I had a few tongue twisters in there, but, my audience always forgives me.
That's good.
So, Ellen, thank you so much for spending some time with me on my little project of reading a body of work, which I think is really illuminating, I believe.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
So, one of the themes that I've noticed in the majority of your books is family ties, family lies, and secrets, which seems to show up in all of your novels.
Yeah, I think pretty much all of them, yeah.
So, why do you think that you are so attracted to families as a focal point for your books?
Well, at least initially, my main character, Jane Lawless, was what is termed an amateur sleuth. In other words, she had no particular reason for being involved in murder investigations. And I've always felt that families were sort of the natural bailiwick of the amateur sleuth, because families are very complex, and there are lots of secrets within families that a police officer or detective, they can't just walk in and demand those answers. They're not going to get them. There's no way for them to get at them. And for me, the amateur sleuth has a kind of a leg up there. She's able to very often infiltrate the family, get to know some of the people in a way a police officer would never be able to do. So that's one reason. The primary reason, though, for me has always been that that's where my interest lies. I'm fascinated by how families work, and very often how they don't work. And since I think a lot of mystery comes from that dynamic, especially the kind of mystery that I write about, as opposed to, say, a PI, which is, street crime and drugs and whatever. It's, for me, the interest was in human behavior, in human beings pushed to the wall, put in a situation where they feel they have no other choice but than to make a truly terrible choice, and then see where the pieces fall after that. So, the book I just turned in, which is called A Whisper of Bones, it'll be out in January of 2018, is again a family, a very dysfunctional family. And the book that I'm working on right now, that I'm going to start writing sometime this winter, is once again, it's kind of it's a divided family that ultimately comes together at the end. I really like the structure of a novel where you start out with 2 desperate, disparate approaches, and as the book moves along, the storylines that that seem so unrelated become more and more related until the end of the book. So anyway, families just fascinate me.
Well, you have one particularly fun character, which at times we get to know her family, and that's Cordelia Thorne. Mm-hmm. And when I read her character and how she's just got this huge personality, and she seems to blunder into so many things and wears these fantastical costumes even when supposed to be low-key. Her definition of low-key is very different than other people's definition of low-key. And
yeah, I think so.
The only time that your books are far more serious, but the only time when I feel like there's that Jesse Chandler, Shea O'Hanlon feel is when Cordelia is sleuthing.
Yeah, I mean, when I started the books, I thought of Cordelia as kind of the salt in the book, if you know what I mean. And she's, she wasn't the main character, and I just would sprinkle her kind of throughout the book. It became apparent to me very, very quickly that readers and my various presses, I would get edits that said, we haven't seen Cordelia in 4 chapters. Where is she? So it became clear that she needed to be a more major part of each book. And she's so much fun to write. I think I nailed her from the very beginning. I understood her. And she was always very available to me in a way that my main character wasn't, and has become a little more so over time. But yeah, I think Cordelia is a character that people either love or hate.
Yeah, she... I also love how she kind of enters the room like the prow of a ship.
Yeah, she's actually... I patterned her somewhat after my oldest friend, who was a theater major at the University of Minnesota, and isn't Cordelia, but is very much like her in many ways. So, whenever I need a Cordelia fix, I just go and visit her.
One of the other... there are 2 things that you do in each book that I find helpful. One of them is that you give a list of the cast of characters and a brief, who they are, which I think frees you up to have more characters, because a lot of times editors or readers will feel if there are too many names, they have to keep too many things in their head, and it can be a little confusing. So having that little cast of characters makes it somewhat like a play, and also gives them the ability to kind of refer to it when they're trying to keep the characters clear in their head.
Right. The Golden Age mystery writer, Naya Marsh, are you familiar with her?
No.
Naya Marsh. She always put a cast of characters in her book, and I like that idea, especially because the books that really I think I used to teach me how to construct a mystery were the P.D. James novels, and I think in her second book, virtually every character's last name began with a B, which it's a very young writer's mistake, but it was very frustrating for me. I mean, the way any writer would like a reader to read their book is all in one sitting. So, you don't lose anything, you don't forget anything, it's all there, it's all laid out. But of course, nobody reads like that. We'll pick a book up and we'll read for an hour, and we put it down, and we might not pick it up again for, a few days or a few weeks. And so what I did with that P.D. James novel was I wrote in the back of the book who these people were, because I could never remember. And that made it so much easier for me to read the books and to actually learn from them. And so I thought that cast of characters at the beginning just, made sense.
The other thing that you do is you have a quote before the books begin. Mm-hmm. Do you have a special magic journal that you collect quotes in that you use at will, or do you just have an amazing memory of all these different things that you've read or seen in theater or on movies and whatnot?
I have not a book or a diary or anything like that, but I have a little place in my folder on my desktop where I'll put quotes if I like them. But very often when I'm writing something, the cosmos sort of leans down and gives me something, and that has happened so many times that I kind of almost expect it now. And I love quotes, which is why I've collected them. So there's never a dearth of that, and I think it's kind of to have that there. It kind of sets the book off, gives you kind of an idea of what might be in store.
What part of the writing process do the quotes come in? Are they inspiration or something that you add after the fact or you discover while you're writing?
They're most often after the fact. The thing that comes first, though, that does have a great bearing on the writing is the title. And I don't, I tell other writers, that this is simply my process. I don't recommend it, but for me, the title has always come first. It helps me think my way thematically into the story, and so that for me is the critical point of entry into the novel.
You also have my brother had this thing that he told me when I was younger, and he said that perceived slights are much more powerful and have more reverberation than actual slights where someone is directly saying or doing something to you. And so Faint Praise, which is one of your earlier books, starts off with a quote from Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man: "Damn with faint praise, assent with civil leer, and, without sneering, teach the rest to sneer."
Yeah, that was kind of what that book was. Well, to some extent, that's what the book was about. I think, pretty much every quote I use has to make thematic sense. So, and I've always liked that.
Yeah, there's another quote that I always blunder through my readings, but I don't care. People have to accept me for who I am. It's actually one of the things that is often taught to beginner writers or even writers who have experience is how important that first chapter is in that first line. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs, skip a few, and then get towards the end of chapter 1, and this is from Faint Praise. Okay. On the day after Thanksgiving, the first floor of the Fauché Tower in downtown Minneapolis was packed with carolers, ushering in Christmas. Earlier in the afternoon, Santa himself had put in an appearance. In all the commotion and good cheer, no one paid much attention to an elegantly dressed woman, entered from the Marquette Avenue, and moved quietly to the elevators. When the metal doors opened and the woman, clutching a tasteful gray leather purse, stepped on. "We're going all the way to the top," exclaimed a small boy proudly as the others in the elevator looked at him with amused smiles. The boy's father quickly put a hand on his shoulder to quiet him. Silence returned to the small compartment as it sped upward. On the 24th floor, the woman got off, turning briefly and giving the boy a conspiratorial wink. Then, squaring her shoulders, she proceeded to the office on the northwest corner of the building where a young man was waiting. She nodded a greeting, at the same time taking in the almost empty white room. A single chair sat in the corner. Stepping to the windows, she could see the view of downtown landscape, everything she had hoped for, historic St. Anthony's in the distance, James J. Hill's famous stone bridge spanning the Mississippi, the newly gentrified warehouse district. It was all waiting for her, buried in white winter coating. There was no doubt about it. This had been the right decision. Standing in the quiet office, she felt a shiver of anticipation, a heightened sense of her own mission. And I'm skipping to the last page. Leaning against a window frame, she whispered the words Fauché Tower, remembering that the old man who had built it back in the late 20s, Wilbur Fauché, had called Minneapolis this new Canaan, this promised land. He felt exactly the same way when she viewed it for the first time. So much promise, such energy, and just like the tower, a building which was meant to symbolize optimism and the exuberance of the roaring 20s, her life had taken on the same quality of failed dreams. And I thought that was like a really powerful way to capture that particular character, and also to, I guess, start the book off with a lie of a sort.
I'm sorry, do what? I didn't get that.
And to start the book off with a kind of lie.
Oh, okay. Yes, it did. Yeah, it did. Boy, I haven't. That is so interesting. I haven't read that in 25 years. That was a chapter that I always used to read when I would go out and promote that book, and I was rarely able to get through it without crying, because I loved that character so much.
Yeah.
So that's just amazing to hear that again.
Yeah, it just struck me, and one of the things that frustrates me about reading your books is I'm like, this time I'm going to guess it right.
Oh, well, I guess I like to be fooled, and if I'm not fooled by a mystery, it's okay if I still like the ride, but I like being fooled, so I guess that's something I hope that I'm able to pull off at least occasionally.
You totally tricked me, and each time, because I've read so many of your novels, and I'm like, I'm gonna get it this time. I'm gonna pay really close attention. I'm gonna see those red herrings when they happen. I'm gonna notice those false friends, and I'm gonna know the lies behind the unreliable narrator. It never happens.
Yeah, well, it's all misdirection, isn't it? I mean, it's not as easy as it looks.
It is not easy at all. I can't even imagine. That's you write very complex books in order to keep so many secrets. Like, that's another theme that I've seen in a lot of your books. And in order for you to kind of go on the journey and discover what's the lie and what's the truth and who is behind everything, and the messy kind of complexity of who they are. You know?
I mean, they often say, at least I've heard this said about mystery novels, and it's actually something I used when I was teaching, and that is that there are a lot of ways to look at the construction of a mystery, but one way is that, you come into the story and you sort of look around and you see what's going on, and you think you understand it, you think you've got it, and then as the story moves along, you realize that that's merely the apparent story, and the real story starts leaking up through that story, and it takes you a while, to see that. And that, to me, that kind of sleight of hand is what is so satisfying about writing a mystery.
The other thing that I thought was interesting, you directly name it in of course, I was like, in Rest for the Wicked. You talk about how it was a nice story about DeAndre, that it was kind of family mythology, his experience growing up. And that's another thing that I notice in each of the book. You kind of discover the mythology, and what I find fascinating with Jane is when she can sense, but that's not true.
When she what now?
When she recognizes that something's not true, where she can tell that somebody is selling her a pretty story, but that's not the truth, and it kind of spurns on her both her curiosity and her righteous indignation.
You're right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and especially I think within families. I mean, I know that within my own family. Especially something like Thanksgiving, or when the family's all sitting around the table, all the grandkids, all the kids. We have 2 daughters and 2 sons-in-law, and you start talking about all the things you remember, and you're laughing. But as you're doing that, you're cementing these things into the memories of the kids that may not necessarily remember those things all that well themselves, but they've heard the family story so many times that, they think that they remember it accurately, when what they're remembering really is the story that's been told around the table year after year after year. And, I saw that operating in my family of origin, and also, in Kathy and our family. And it's shape. And it's every time it's retold, it might move a little bit different direction. Anyway, that to me is an interesting thing to follow in a mystery novel, because those are, what's the word I want to use there? They can be lies. They can be misrepresentations, even though everybody believes them.
And you even had the book named Vital Lies, which...
Yeah, that's an actual psychological term. The vital lie is the lie that we tell ourselves, that we sort of need for one reason or another. For instance, a kid might tell themselves, I have a happy family, when in reality the mother or the father is a raging drunk, and it's not at all a happy family, but they need to tell the outside world that untruth to maintain their psychological equilibrium. And so, I was very interested in that when I started reading about that as a psychological, something that is actually people talk about. And I thought, well, I could use that in a mystery, and that sort of became the genesis of that book.
And the question in more than one of your books is, who's lucid? Who has a true... the ability to look at themselves honestly and see themselves for whom they are, and who is the sicko?
Who is the sicko? Yeah.
Which is the technical term, and because we're all damaged. But what I often am shocked is when a person who seems the most put together or thoughtful, they seem like they're rational. And then when you find out that they're not, that's one of the other, surprises.
Yeah, well, give a man a mask, it's, I think we all tell lies about who we are. We're able to maintain, not necessarily a mask, but we're able to maintain project a personality out into the world that is partially true, but not perhaps entirely true. For instance, I have always wanted to write about a writer who had a pen name, because I do. And very often, I've known this since the very beginning. Ellen Hart is a very different person than my real name, which is Patricia Bainhart. Ellen is my middle name, but the writer Ellen Hart is different. She is far less introverted. She's, not the least bit shy, whereas Pat is. And I've always thought it would be truly interesting to write a book about a writer who does that divergence in their character created a problem, a major psychological problem. And I don't know, maybe somewhere down the line I'll actually write that.
I like it. One of the books that you actually did draw a writer into it was in Faint Praise. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing worse than that. Oh, I read your book. It was interesting. Yeah.
Yep. If there isn't a writer out there that hasn't had faint praise, right?
It's so dreadful.
Yeah, it is dreadful. Yeah. It's painful. Yeah. Well, as a writer, you in a way, not entirely, but in a way, you're bearing your soul. You're producing something which you hope people will love. It's like, walking naked out onto a stage and wondering if people will laugh or throw you a towel. You don't know what the response is going to be, and it's hard. Reviews are hard, and I've always looked at writing as being kind of a body contact sport. You really have to toughen up.
Mm-hmm. One other interesting character that pops up in several of the books is Julia. And what I find interesting about her is that she's really her own worst enemy. And her inability to trust or tell the full truth to Jane, who at one point was her lover, rendered her untrustworthy and shredded the relationship that she was trying to, hold off, it's all going to work out. I'll tell you eventually, it's going to be good,
Yeah. Well, Julia is back in the newer book, so...
Damn that Julia, won't she leave Jane alone?
Yeah, no, she won't. She just can't. So,
what do you think really has her so stuck? That she can't accept that things weren't going to work out, or at least so much as I know.
I think she's a narcissist, for one thing.
Mm.
And I think sometimes she even leans towards sociopathy. I mean, she's done. I don't know which books. I don't remember which books you've read, and honestly, I don't remember where some of this stuff comes in the books. But she's not an entirely good person at all. And
when she was talking to Chess, and called Cordelia the Dragon Lady, I was like, oh hell no.
Well, they're very well matched. They both hate each other. So, it's very interesting working with characters that you have lived with and walked the halls with for 30 years. And they still just absolutely fascinate me. So I guess that's good. When they don't, I should stop writing.
Mm-hmm. Why do you like to use unreliable narrators?
Well, I don't always.
Not always, but there's sometimes when they're in there, they're peppered in. So
Yeah, I was fascinated by Agatha Christie's The Death of Roger Ackroyd. Have you read that?
No.
Okay, it was of its day. It was tour de force. It was one of the first mystery novels that had an unreliable narrator. And at the time I read it, I didn't know that. And I was, going along in the book and thinking that this was what was true. And, and when I got to the end of the book, I was like, wow. And I turned around and I read it over again just to see how she did it. Same thing with, Sarah Waters' second book, Affinity, which I think people didn't like as well as...
Sorry, that book got me so mad.
You didn't like it?
No, I didn't say I didn't like it, but it made me very angry.
Yeah, okay. Well, as a writer, the construction of that book fascinated me. And once again, when I was done with the book, I had to see how she did it. So I went back and I reread it. You have to have unreliable sources, really. I mean, I think you do in a mystery. What she was writing wasn't a mystery, but that's one of the weapons in your arsenal. That's one of the, it's in your toolbox, and you should use it because it's not only interesting to read. I think it's fun to write.
I think that Chess is the name, in The Cruel Ever After, I don't think he would tell the truth if a lie would do, but sometimes he's so earnest about his lies, I think that he believes them himself to a certain degree.
Oh, don't you think liars do believe their lies sometimes? I do. I mean, look at just for example, look at our president. I think there are people who are, truly want something to be the case so badly that they kind of move in that direction.
Do you know who I feel is the bigger liar in the whole charade is Pence. He's so earnest sounding. He seems reasonable, but he's like he's the gaslighter in chief.
Okay, I can't. These books are sometimes 10 and 15 years ago. You have to tell me who that character was.
Oh, Chess was a antiquity stealer.
But yeah.
Oh no, I'm thinking about. I'm sorry. I was talking about Vice President Pence.
Oh, Pence. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know if he's as. I don't want to insult anyone. I don't think he's as deluded. I think he knows what he's doing.
Oh, he knows exactly what he's doing. That's the reason why I find him much more sinister, because he seems... He projects reasonableness, and evenness, but he is such a gaslighter. Which is a term that I've only heard in the last few years. But basically, you could be looking at something and say that's red, and he's like, "Oh no, that's blue. That's totally blue," and you're like, maybe it's blue.
Well, I mean, do you remember how the end of 1984, how that worked? I think it was, they were saying, I can't remember exactly, but it was 2 and 2 is 5, and he said, no, it's 4. And at the very end of the book, he was saying, yeah, it's 5. They won. In other words, it's a great book.
Shudder.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yes. Like, I want to be contemporaneous, but at the same time, I just can't even wrap my brain over I can't. It's just, it's so absurd. Yeah. It's like, it has to be fiction, but it's real. Bringing us back to fiction, one of the, I'll stumble over reading another one of your quotes. The reason why I'm choosing this, it's from A Small Sacrifice, which is one of your earlier books, is that it really kind of gives the contrast between two characters, which is Cordelia and Diana.
Oh, sure.
The only real difference in the two apartments was the decorating, or the lack thereof. Cordelia scattered here and there. I missed the line. Cordelia was heavily into her purple phase. The wall color, the objets d'art, scattered here and there, confirmed her influence. Annie liked posters of handsome blonde men. A Robert Redford shrine had been set up in her bedroom. Cordelia, whose room contained only one star photo, Betty Davis, told Annie she was fixated on blonde, but Annie just shrugged it off. Diana liked clothes. Her room was a jungle of outrageous costumes hung on hangers dangling from strings she had fixed to walls in a crisscross pattern. As far as anyone could tell, Diana fixated on only one person, herself. No photo, no, right? No photo of any kind found its way to her walls. And later in the book, when you see the space that she is using, you can see the same kind of influence, like her narcissism and how that affected her ability to realize that she was an alcoholic.
Completely, yeah.
And like one of the directors that had been drawn into a contract with her was, nobody told me she was a drunk.
Yeah.
Which is like that oh shit moment. Like, let's say you're signing this contract with somebody who's won everything that you can think of, Oscars and Emmys, and he's like, oh, this is a great opportunity, and it's very edgy, going to be in this space, and then he's like, oh my God, she's a lush.
I know. You're like, that should be in the contract somewhere, but they don't do that. They're not that honest.
No. Earlier, you were mentioning masks, and you actually have a book which is called The Mirror and the Mask, which I thought was a really fascinating psychological subject, which I'll have you explain a little bit more. But I wanted to...
A long time ago.
I know, I'm so evil. I'm like, yeah, you're going to have to remember it while I'm reading two of the quotes, which I will stumble over because that's my yub. Maggie, truth, everybody keeps hollering about the truth. Well, the truth is as dirty as lies. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof by Tennessee Williams.
Sorry, I think that's a great quote.
It's kind of awesome. I'll do it again, see if I can stumble that. Truth, everybody keeps hollering about truth. Well, the truth is as dirty as lies. And then the second quote is, we are what we pretend to be, which is from Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut, which I find fascinating.
He's one of my favorite writers, yeah.
So the mirror and the mask was, explained by the Annie character. And she was fascinated with Greek mythology. And what was interesting was, actually, there's a meme that came out politically not too long ago, and it was a wolf, and there were sheep around. And the wolf says, "I'm going to eat you." And the sheep say, "He's so honest, isn't that refreshing?"
That's great. Love that.
I know, it's always stuck in my head, and it's and I can't remember.
I love that.
"I'm going to eat you."
He's so honest. How refreshing. That's great.
Which is just
no playing. That'd make a great quote in the beginning of a book.
Was it Maya Angelou who said, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them?
Yeah, that's right. And you know what? We often don't.
And what I find interesting is in the beginning of the book, she gave Jane the key to who she was and who she wasn't by explaining about the mirror and the mask and explaining about duplicity and when people are telling the truth or reflecting what they think the truth is or what the person who's listening wants the truth to be. And, that's a shifting sand. And so I find that fascinating. But it so that's why that meme always pops in my head.
Yeah.
I'm going to eat you.
Write that down when we're done.
I'm going to eat you. And basically that encapsulated the candidates at the time for the presidential election, a recent presidential election. I'm going to eat you.
Well, he, our president, did tell us who he was. And for a lot of people, apparently, it was fine. I guess I believed what he was saying, and but I didn't think he'd be as bad as he has ended up being. I mean, it's as you said, it's still inconceivable to get your mind around that.
I love watching Rachel Maddow's nightly consternation.
Yeah, we usually watch her too.
She's fascinating, and she's actually, in a way, her A-block, her first segment, is a lot like a mystery writer because
it's a narrative. She always gives you a narrative, and that's why it's so compelling, I think.
Yes, and the thing is, I just like a mystery writer, half the time I'm like, where is she going with this?
I know, yeah.
That's why she's so wonderful. That's why, I do enjoy watching my MSNBC. But on days where I know something is going to be repeated constantly, whatever that particular flashy subject is of the day, I'm waiting for Rachel. And I always get really miffed when somebody's replaced her for the night. Not that, it's not like
that you don't like them, but they don't give you the same context,
No.
And it's that context you're looking for. At least I am.
That's why she's number one. That's why she just recently won 2 more Emmys.
I know. Yeah.
And it's the storytelling. That's what grips me. That's what I find so fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
So let's see. And my magical mystery tour of all my quotes. So, I still do paper notes. So let's see what I have not touched upon. Well, getting back to your first novel, when these characters came to you, Jane, Cordelia, and even the characters that were at the heart of the mystery, what was this experience like when you finally decided to sit down and write your first book?
What was it like?
Yeah.
Well, I had a very amorphous idea when I started writing, and I wrote maybe 300 pages, 300 pages, and it was just awful, and I knew it. It didn't go anywhere. I didn't know where I was going to go with it, and it was already too long. It was truly terrible, and So I spent an entire winter reading P.D. James' novels and taking them apart and actually doing intuitively what I tell students to do now, which is, to break books down and take them apart and look at how they're constructed. I had an idea and I wanted to pursue it, and while I was reading P.D. James, I rethought through how to write the book. And during that time, I rewrote the first chapter a couple times. I had a friend who's a poet locally, and she brought another guy over who was a writer, and I remember sitting on the table on the couch and just sweating because he was going to read that first chapter. And he did, and he looked up when he was done, and he said, "You can write." And man, I lived on that for years. Because he was the only person that I knew who had been published. So I started the one spring, and I was through in the fall, and then it was a matter of, now what do I do with it? Is it good enough to be published? I liked it, but my partner liked it, and my friends liked it, but you can't trust them.
No, you really shouldn't trust them.
You really should. So I looked around to get the book published, and I was lucky enough to find a couple of presses that wanted it. So I went with Seal Press in Seattle.
Well, honest words are better than, the goobriest praise, especially early on.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, I knew where I fit. I knew I had a long way to go. The first editorial comments I got from my editor, who, I don't know if you know Barbara Wilson, but she wrote Sisters of the Road and Murder in the Collective and some of the earliest lesbian mystery fiction. I didn't even understand what she was saying to me. I didn't know the words. I didn't know what the terms meant, and I guess maybe I thought I did, and I did my best to make the book as good as it could be. But years later, I looked back at those editorial notes she gave me, and it was only then that I realized what she was actually saying to me. I had a long way to go as a writer, and I knew that.
When did you first learn of Gene Redmond's books, the Mickey Knight series?
Gosh, I can't remember. Someone gave me a copy of Death by the Riverside, and in it was a note. I've never told her this, and we're good friends. In it was a note that she had written to somebody in New York, and I still don't remember how I got that book. But it was certainly after. I think it was probably somewhere along my second book that I found her. I knew about Catherine Forrest, and I'd read one of her books. And I knew about Barbara Wilson, and I'd read, I think, 2 or 3 of her books. But Jean came along a little bit later.
Yeah, she did come later. Catherine B. Forrest, I actually found some of her mysteries in my local library, which is kind of shocking because I live, unfortunately, in a fairly conservative area for the people who are year-round. I live in a beach community, so the people who are visiting are a lot more liberal, but the people who are around all the time are not. So I was like, look at this, and I took a photograph. And Jean's actually, I believe she was the first person that I read for this series, the Mickey Knight series, and she's got that. She decided to write that series because she wanted to read that kind of character. And it wasn't there. So what was it like to kind of watch other lesbian authors present these strong women characters who, were outside of the boys' club, so to speak?
We're outside of the boys' club?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was extremely important. It was, of course, it was extremely important. I remember I was in, D.C., and I went to the bookstore there. I was on tour, and The Intersection of Law and Desire had just come out, and everybody was talking about it. And I saw it on the table in there and bought a copy. And I remember reading it while I was on the road, and I was absolutely blown away by that book. Honestly, I mean, you know, Gene is just a phenomenal writer. Anyway, those books were so important, but Gene's writing was so elegant and emotional, and her characters were so rich. Anytime I read a book that feels like that to me, it just makes me want to be a better writer. And I think, of course, all writers are trying to write the books that they want to read. And back in the day, they didn't exist anywhere. After I went to Random House, they were trying to figure out how to get the L word on the front cover of the book, and they used a quote from Simon Scapatone. And I mean, walking through airports at the time, because Mass Market got into the airports, and that's how it was published. And seeing that book in the bookstores in the airports was just, I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was really exciting.
So how did you, I mean, not like, like, and then I suddenly cracked right in, that, I guess, that glass ceiling, if you will, to become a grandmaster?
Oh, I don't know how that happened. I mean, that I just kept, for 30 years, I've been putting one foot in front of the other, trying to do the best work I could do, trying to raise the bar with each book, working on my writing, teaching, promoting, I have been very lucky. I have loved the life I've lived. And I'm older now, and I'm not doing so much of that. But what was the question again?
No, you answered the question, which is...
Okay, all right.
But was it, what did it feel like to get... Was it a letter or a phone call when you found out?
Oh, it was a phone call from a woman that I knew. She's the vice president of the organization, and she said, "Are you sitting down?" And that's, when someone starts a phone call or even a conversation like that, it's either going to be really good news or really bad news. And I was sitting down, so I said, "Yeah, I'm sitting down." And she said, "Well, Mr. Writers of America is naming you their 2017 Grand Master." And I don't think I said anything for quite a while. And what I was going through in my head, and what I eventually said to her was, "Are you sure you've got the right heart?" Because, it was, I looked at that list many, many times over my career. Those were my teachers. Those were the books that gave me such reading pleasure and that I learned so much from. And, I thought, I never in my wildest imagination ever thought I'd be on that list. It still seems just crazy,
It's so thrilling. And one of the things that I love about lesbian authors and LGBT authors in general is how accessible they still are to their readers. And so they're not in this separate zone. It's kind of like when I was in Ireland and I would go to see some live music, and after the show you could just, walk up to the musicians and hang out with them and buy them a pint. And I thought that was just so wonderful, and in the way that just would not necessarily be possible here. So I kind of...
Well, I've never thought of myself... we're all writers. We're all trying to do the same thing. I'm really always so happy that I have readers. It's... And I guess I would have to say, in general, mystery writers, they don't see themselves as writing the great American novel, and so they are more, generally speaking, more approachable and less literary in the sense that everything they're doing is so precious and important. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I've developed a skill, and I think probably was born with a certain skill, and I'm just, I'm very, very thankful for the life I've had.
Mm-hmm. Well,
there's no reason not to be accessible. I don't.
Well, I mean, it's in a way, it's an honor to lesbian writers to have one of our own in that special list. I'm
glad, because I have to say, I do think it's a big deal. I'm still very blown away by it and very touched and extremely honored, and I do think it's a big deal. I'm glad it happened to somebody, and there are a number of people who it could have happened to, and I'm just very glad that they chose me.
It's great. I'm not sure if the audio picked it up, but because I live in a beach community, every once in a while a car will go by, and our neighbors, the renters, just showed up, and so they were whooping. And I don't know if you heard it, but if you did, ignore it.
I didn't. No. No.
I don't know if it picked up on my mic or not, so I just wanted to, acknowledge that it existed.
Yeah. Okay. No, I didn't hear it.
So I'm taking the spotlight off of you, Master. And
That's
bringing
fine.
it back to your work. And one of the things that I found, well, I can kind of make a correlation between Mickey Knight and Jane Lawless, in that Mickey's always been wounded in some way or another emotionally. It's like the physical stuff is the least of it. What I found interesting with Jane was when she had to deal with physical infirmity.
Yeah, she was hurt pretty badly in one book, and what I was doing there, and I felt very strongly about it, was there are so many mystery novels in which the main character gets the crap beat out of them, and then they just move right along, and no repercussions, and no problem, everything's good. Well, that isn't the way the world works, and so I wanted Jane to have some repercussions from that. And then I started getting emails from readers saying, could she be any more depressing? Move on. So I thought, okay.
It's like, move the fuck on. We want to have our, Jane the Amazing.
Yeah. Well, and there's a bit of that, and I did move on, but I think everything piles up for human beings. Nobody gets out of this life without scars and without pain, and so not to represent that in the novels, I think, would really be a disservice to the character, which you really want to be as well-rounded. Even though this person is fictional, you want them to feel alive and real.
For whom the bell tolls, I have a grandfather clock.
Okay.
So what's interesting is that I did not anticipate Jane being so hostile to being a little fuzzy. Well, obviously she likes being sharp, but also the weakness in one of her legs, and how much she resented that cane and didn't want people to see her weaknesses, and sometimes she hurt herself even more because she was being stubborn and wanted to project a strength that she didn't quite have yet. And I actually was surprised. Like, I thought that she'd not... Enlightened isn't the word, but I didn't think she'd be so hostile towards it. And that's very real, because a lot of times in print, they like to make the person who's experiencing a physical challenge be all chipper and, triumphing over, all odds, and, that kind of thing. And it needs to be represented how exactly she experienced it. And I think that one of the most beautiful things an author can do is make visible those who feel invisible and are not represented. And there are people who are pissed at their game, at their bodies, for failing them. And
and I'll tell you, I hadn't thought about that, and that's interesting that you point that out, because I have a cane now, and that is exactly my reaction. And I had completely forgotten I gave that reaction. So, you start approaching your 70s, and these things, and I am pissed because you expect your body to go on forever, and it doesn't. So, limitations are hard. And Jane was experiencing a bit of that. Maybe I was playing with that. I don't know. But I did. That's interesting. Thank you for pointing that out.
It's like, I always shock my guest at some point during an interview.
Yeah.
It's a gift. You're like, I never thought of it that way.
I didn't. I hadn't thought of that situation in years, because that's a long time ago in terms, of the writing. So interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that I enjoy. I always like to read something in sequence. I like to read all of the books, and I'll be honest, I actually kind of burned myself out. Like, I used to do weekly shows where I would review a book, and then I found myself not, even though I loved the authors and I loved their writing, I found myself uninspired in the actual reading department. And in an attempt to rediscover my love, I decided to back away from it. And then I was like, you know what? I still really like talking to authors. I like supporting their work. And then I was like, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to have guests on that I've already read their body of work and read it again. And when you read something in succession, when you read them in the order that the author has written them, you will pick up on things that you probably wouldn't if it was the natural progression of I read it when it came out and then the next book came out however long afterwards. And I used to tease Carson Tate because Afternoon Delight showed up in too many of her books.
Oh, really?
Yes. That phrase is so unique. It's so unique.
The thing is, as a writer, you don't know you're doing that. You have to cut her some slack.
Oh my gosh, it was so funny. And because I love her stuff too. She's fantastic. And she's a pantser, which is amazing that she can create what she can create without outlining or planning. Especially.
Oh, she's a great writer, yeah.
She writes romantic suspense intrigue. And she was writing a book at the time when I had interviewed her, and I think she put it in that book as an homage.
Oh, she did. That's great. Good for her.
Or she was being coy with me. I can't remember it, like, between the time that it actually was published, but I thought it tickled me that she was joking that she was going to put it in there again.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So it's those little things that you'd only pick up on as you read them in succession.
And it's the kind of thing that maybe writers don't want you to pick up on. You begin to see, that there are some overlaps and where there shouldn't be. But part of the problem for that is, you have people that are looking at your books in terms of the book itself, and make sure that things are consistent, copy editors. But they don't go back and look at your old books. I had a character in different series that in one book I said she was 5 feet, and the other one said she was 5'3". And I didn't catch it, and nobody caught it. And I had a student come up to me one night and ask what was going on. And, the only thing I could think of was that she wore spike heels in one book and not in the other.
You're so cute. I think.
What are you going to do?
Greg Herron was teaching a class in New Orleans, and he was talking about how he never kept character Bibles, and he kind of wished that he had.
Oh, you should.
Because
but then you get too far into the series, and you're stuck.
I know. And then he was like, he had given a character a name. It must have been, like a one-off sentence kind of thing. And then several books later had given that character a different name, and then joked, oh, well, that's her middle name or whatever. And I won't mention the series because I don't like to point people out. But in one book, the first book she was 5'8", and the second book she was 6 foot tall. I'm like, she grew tall in the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah. That's as good of an explanation as any.
It was a zombie apocalypse. She grew.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're works of human beings, so they're going to be problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who do you like reading now?
Who do I like reading?
Yeah, now. What are some of the books that are on your coffee table?
I've got a book by Jennifer McMahon. Have you read her?
No.
Oh, she's really good. She's a lesbian, and sometimes that has something to do with her books. They can be a bit. They're suspense. There's often an element of when some otherworldly kind of thing in them. I've gone through, I don't know, 3 or 4 of her books recently, and I really think she's a good writer. Who else am I reading? I really love. Have you read anything by Rachel Gold?
I haven't, but I want to. I think she's going to be the keynote next year.
Oh, good. She is phenomenal. I'm lucky because she lives in town, and so we get together periodically and have coffee. But she is just so smart and such. I mean, she gets so much about, just intuitively gets so much about how to construct a story. If you haven't, for anybody out there who has not read her, I would really encourage you to do so. I think she's really going to go places.
What book can you think of that you started and were mad that it kept you up all night?
The last book that kept me up all night. Oh, God.
I'm not trying to stump you, I swear. It's just there are times when, I'm like, damn you, author.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. Probably, and this is kind of out of left field, but it's a book called Defending Jacob. And I don't know that I stayed up all night, but I surely couldn't put it down. The man who wrote it's William Landay, and he wasn't anybody I'd ever known. And someone recommended the book, and I thought, well, take a chance on it. And honestly, that book is something I still think about. Oh God, that's a great book. And I have to say, and I know a lot of people really hate Gillian Flynn, probably because she's so successful, but her first 2 books, before Gone Girl, were utterly fascinating to me. Sharp Objects and I can't think of the name of the other one. I don't think they kept me up all night, but whoa, those were terrific. And her writing is so fresh and interesting, and I really, really like her books. I mean, there's so many writers that I like.
Well, what about your amazing writing community in your hometown, in the area where you live? I know that I believe that Jessie Chandler, is she nearby?
Oh yeah, she's a great friend. Yeah, yep.
And L'Oreal Lake.
Who?
L'Oreal Lake. Does she live there?
Yeah, Lori was here for many years and then moved back to Portland. But we're still great friends, and she hasn't done a lot of writing in the last few years. She said been involved with other things. She's starting a press and whatnot. But yeah, she was certainly part of the writing scene here for a long time. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on names. I think people are always surprised by the number of writers in the Twin Cities just in general, and in Minnesota in particular. You go to other parts of the country, and it just isn't the case. But I think that the reading public here people read here, and there's such a strong support system for both readers and writers that if you're going to be, other than the Seattle and Portland area just in general, I think that Upper Midwest is a great place to be a writer or a reader.
First time I ever, it wasn't that I've never heard of the Twin Cities, but was reading the Prey series by John Sanford.
Mm-hmm, sure. He lives here. Well, not anymore, but he did.
You know, like, what I find interesting is I was reading him when I was a teenager, and I was going through all his books and Grisham and, you know, generally the mystery and crime fiction authors of the day. And I used to be a lifeguard at a condominium complex, and a lot of times had a lot of time on my hands.
That's great.
And so those are the types of things that I was reading. But what I find interesting were the books that I was attracted to, and the characters and the style that captivated me at the time. I've read those books again and not felt the same.
You can't go back again sometimes.
I know, it's like that book, You Can't Go Home Again.
Yeah.
And also what shocked me, not so much that there's popular fiction that I no longer felt tight with, but I read Lord of the Rings, I think, maybe 4 times in my teens and early 20s. This was before the films came out. And then several years later, I was tutoring a boy, and I had him reading it, and I was reading it at the same time, so that I could kind of be with him during it. And I was like, why is this not feeling the same? Like, I was so passionate about Aragorn and, like, his leadership qualities, and there's so many characters that, you know, I found spectacular in those books. And then I read it at that time, and I was having a really hard time getting through it.
It really is interesting. I was in a writing group for many years with a number of local writers, and I was having a conversation with a guy named Pete Houtman. Excuse me. He won the National Book Award a few years ago, and what he was saying to me was, "Isn't it interesting how some of the books that you read, particularly as a youth, that made you want to be a writer, when you go back to them now, you can't stand to read them."
Right? Isn't that so strange? Like, I look at them and I'm like, oh my, not Tolkien, of course, but I look at some of the books and I'm like, this is, I mean, formulas work. There's some authors who can knock it out of the park, even though they're rocking a formula. But they're, like, I felt that the quality of the Prey series just kept on deteriorating as time went by. And that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking of when I am doing these retrospectives. And one of the magician's tricks that both you and Gene Redman have been able to perform is that your stuff is still good. You know,
stuff is still what?
Your stuff is still good. It's still worth reading. It's strong. It stands up. You
Good.
know,
I'm glad. I mean, when that stops happening, you know, a writer that I like very much, his name is Dennis Lehane, and he wrote a series set in Boston, a very hard-boiled series, for many years, and he stopped. He called it the hamster wheel, and he said, I just had to get off of it. You know, in New York, commercial speed is a book a year, so you have to have a book out a year. And if you write a complex story, that can be hard. He said that he was standing in front of a bookstore once. After his last book came out, he was looking at the window, at his books in the window, and as he was looking at the books in the window, he realized how it should have ended. But it didn't end that way because he didn't have time. He didn't have the time to really work on it and think about it. And he was so grateful at that point that he made the decision to simply stop writing that. I think we've all read particularly series where, you know, they just don't seem to have the spark they once did. And, you know, what happens is the writer has lost interest, but is still obviously getting contracts. Mm-hmm. And that isn't always a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, this has been a wonderful, fascinating conversation. It's been an honor to interview you.
Well, this was really fun. Thank you so much.